Welcome, everyone, to a draw-along course on architecture. And this course is predicated on the notion that there is a village of 100 people that is a fractionalized reduction of the 9 billion people we have on the planet. And of those 100 people, there's a way to determine how many people belong to which faiths. Right now, if you go online and check out the website for a village of 100 people, you'll find that the Roman Catholic Church is the largest unified religious organization with over half of the world's Christians being Catholic. So we'll start with the largest and the most dominant and work our way through the major religions and then get to a couple secondary and tertiary religions along the way. And by the time you reach 10, you'll have sort of a global connection to the variety of geometries and the languages of the built form and architecture. So our start today in the Catholic Church is going to be fairly long within its generation of ideas from the birth of Christianity to this notion of a split between the church in after the first millennium, which created the Western Catholic organization and then the Eastern Orthodox, which we'll see next. So our stand-in for the Catholic is going to be Reims Cathedral. So you should have downloaded the PDF with REIMS on the base of which gives you base tick marks, which we're going to draw from later in the sketch. In the meantime, we're going to walk through some of the sort of normalized ideas about the idea of a cathedral in French culture at the time. And we'll explore the ideas of its structure and construction, as well as obviously the plan type, elevation, and then our drawing itself will be in 3D perspective. So like all architecture, there is a symbolism in the language of it, whether it's ecclesiastical or not. There's an idea behind it. Right now, the head of the church, the Bishop of Rome, claims an unbroken succession from St. Peter, the first Bishop of Rome. So it's all predicated on the language of the Christian faith. And so the dogma of it in plan type, where you typically start looking about architecture, is a series of growth of cruciform shaped plans. You see they're all sort of self-similar and having an X or cross shape to it, which is representative to Christ on the cross. And so basically all the plans as they grow in scale, they move from the earliest in terms of what was possibility in the late Romanesque, early Gothic, to the high Gothic, which we'll see today at Reims. They move across this processional path. So looking at any one of the plans here, you simply start on the western edge of the church, which is the part of where the people from the urban city aspect arrive at the church, and they make their way through the body of Christ, the legs of Christ, to a crossing. At that crossing where the sacraments take place, that is the heart of Christ on the cross. And then beyond that, on the crucifix, is Christ's head. And this part of the church, more often than not, is left for the clergy or the sacred founders of the church, for instance. And that'll meet toward the east. As the sun rises, the light is let in the great stained glass of all these churches to brighten the church. So they start their day before they go to the fields in an agrarian society, and they come to Mass. They end their day going to Mass, and they retreat back to their local housing, the rest of the town, for the rest of the day. And then the same cycle starts the next day as you move through the calendar. So you can see they're all sort of brethren or related in terms of the plan type there. So that's sort of a constant. It's just a matter of what type of budget, scale, and the performance of these actually competing for scale and size over the course of the year. So early, middle, and late Gothic or high Gothic is a sequence of building taller, bolder, more impressive types of interiors. So if we remove this here and take a look at one of the sections through here, you get a sense now scale-wise that walking through that big nave, if I give you the idea of how tall a human being would be, our pencil type for our color pencil, the black we use to draw with, that's about the size of a human figure inside the space. So it's really meant to be, in this case, when they're celebrating the life of Our Lady, Notre Dame de Reims, the idea is to celebrate her bastion, her celestial kingdom on earth. So when you walk up the steps and step into the main nave here, you're impressed by this very heavenly interior. So it soars as much as it possibly can, so you don't feel like you're of this earth once you're inside the cathedral. Now, to support that large nave, which is sort of the sanctuary that is the presence of the heavens on earth, that with stone is very difficult in terms of the physics behind it, because the farther you take material off the face of the earth, the more dependent that is on secondary structure to support that weight. So what happens here, if you look at the whole diagram of this, even though we look at it as a rectangle, it's really supported by a pyramidal effect, where at the top it's supported once, supported twice, supported by piers at the edge. So in fact, if you draw that, it works much like the Great Pyramids in Egypt, which have stood for thousands of years, to counter thrust the need for these to push the building out away from its vertical arraignment there. And that's stereotypical, just like in the elevations and the plan types, where it's used over and over again, where there are side aisles, sometimes even double aisles, to support the throw of the interior nave. So common to all, certainly the high Gothic church of the time, the one probably dominant Gothic church, which is probably the third or fourth most visited building on the planet, probably after the Parthenon, certainly the Great Pyramids in Egypt, is Notre Dame in Paris. And this is sort of the great high Gothic church, kind of moved from early Gothic towards high Gothic, and it's built out from 1163 on, and then completes itself to a certain point and then stops because it never has its finials done, the spires on top of the two western towers to it. It has a lovely crossing tower to it, but it does have those staples of the western front, the long projection of the nave that goes back toward the ambulatory, and finally the apse in the back, and then all the flying buttresses that support and hold up this interior nave volume. As a type, then, by the time it's towards its stage of being finished, we see the growth of the next stage. So Reims is built even longer and a bit taller, and that'll be our subject for the day. But you can see they share the same type of kindred plan type and structural prowess of what's possible with stone in the high Gothic era. The earlier church was destroyed by fire in 2010, and so a new building camp came out to make it bigger and broader. And so it's got all, again, the pieces we're going to look at in terms of designing this in 3 dimensions, so you get a sense of being on the site, looking up at, in this case, more so the front elevation here, because what Reims is really known for in the growth of the Gothic church over time is its bar tracery and its amount of actual sculptural quality of elements around the actual capacity of the building itself. So if I simply bring down the access ratio of lighting here, you see a little bit more detail on the skin of the building. And so we'll try to flesh some of that out in sketch format. But at one point, there were 2,300 statues just on the western facade itself, because back then, most of society was illiterate. The agrarian community didn't have access to education like we have today. So they really told the story, the biblical stories, through statuary, through stained glass, through graphics, so to speak. So the building itself has to read as like a kinetic type of storyland itself by looking at the statues, the symbolism, the ideas behind how it's decorated. And we'll see that as we sketch this out in the course of the next 45 minutes. So the key point to all access is to find out, when we're sketching, just like the introduction lecture showed, that there is a point of finding the box light aspect of all your architecture, and start with those and find the horizon line and the vanishing point. So from our tick marks here, we're going to find that the tops of the 2 towers are indicated here, and they're parallel in height, they're parallel in size, they're twins, and they're going to come down from the upper right down to a vanishing point. We'll carry this out for now, and we'll kind of eliminate it later on with some value. But you can see that's rushing off the page to the right over here. And subsequent stages on the front elevation, all being parallel lines, those are parallel coming across here, all rush back, even to the base of the building itself is going to rush up to that horizon line. So we can simply do a line that will generate that flow of form that's going to move off the page. Now, as I bring these down, they're becoming more and more horizontal and not quite so acute of an angle coming down. So that when we get down to a line where it absolutely is flat compared to being parallel to the top and bottom of your piece of paper, right about at this point, it shows where our eye height is from the view shed of how we're perceiving ROMs on this particular stage set, so to speak. So we are going to draw the cathedral from this view of looking at the dominant west elevation. That's sort of the base of the cross, which creates an access point to the plaza out front, which is typical of all these cathedrals where the city convenes, uses this as a backdrop for stage plays. And we're to show a little bit of its massing, we're going to view it from a bit so we see the return of the crossing over here on the left. So we'll see some of the flying buttresses coming down to support the nave. At the crossing, it comes out its T shape, and that'll cover up then the rest of the cathedral that goes back around the apse on the back side. So we're really going to see the front elevation most as our dominant part of the subject matter, but we want to show some of the massing behind it because if we did something too much straight on, we'd lose the generation of volume. We want to show just how long and powerful this cathedral is on the site. So with that in mind, and since we've found that horizontal line of where the eye height is, so we are far enough back so we can take this all in from the other end of the plaza. The plaza slopes up a bit, so as you walk to it, you'd actually go down the slope and come in here because a lot of times in contemporary times, the city level itself builds up a little bit higher than the cathedral. So we're a little bit up, but at this point from our distance, our vanishing point for a person standing would be right about an eye height, maybe 2 inches off the bottom of the paper. So that's the horizon line. And this point on the left is the left vanishing point. And the right then, again, is well off the page. You can see these two lines are going to meet probably another 8 inches off of the sheet of paper. We want to be aware of that and realize that any horizontal line, they're going to be parallel in space, but they're never going to converge until they're off the paper over here on the right. Now, as soon as you come to the corner of the boxes, of the two towers up here, we can drop those sides down. The top of those boxes are rushing back to the left vanishing point. So this little point up here is coming back down to this point on the left side. So we want to be mindful of that coming down and hitting this point over here. The back of this box comes down, hits that point that way. So we know informationally that all the horizontals on the left side of this now that we see, the return of the sides of the columns will rush back to our point on the left. Now, in the front facade of all these cathedrals that are again sort of legacy of each other, they all sort of build on the language of the predecessor, are typically 3 portals which access the general public in. On daily activities, it's either the left or the right, which is a smaller door than the main one, which is typically open for only really large ceremonies. And Reims is known for its ceremonies of coronations of kings over the years. There's some 32 different French kings that were crowned inside of Reims cathedrals, as this was the sort of place of that, even incorporating Charles VII, who was there with Joan of Arc at his side. So there's more of a heroic prominence to this, but in this case, because of the sculptural quality of it, can you get a sense when I rotate this around just how deep these are in terms of the doors are pushed into a cavernous like, almost like architecture outside the architecture. This is sort of a built form. It isn't simply just go to the skin of the building and walk in a door. You're actually capturing a large exterior space that's crowned by these archways. And that's important to us to know that if you rotate this on this side, they're actually popping out beyond the base of the towers themselves, which is really a spectacle of sort of a relationship between receiving the people in the plaza out front and preparing them for the movement inside the interior of the cathedral. So what we want to do then, place this over here for a second, is I've got the tick marks to show the tops of those arches. We simply want to draw both sides down. So we find those 3 arcades that are there. And now we have to do, because we're on this side of it, we're going to come from the underside, because the tops of this going back would project back to our left vanishing point. And now we're going to see more of the right side of these cavernous arcades, and then a little bit of the left side as it comes down, because we're looking at it from the right corner over here. So it sort of created the depth of that room there to hold on to that. And they come down to a bastion in the front. And now to kind of sit this down, this square base for the first floor of this is going to come to the base of those. And now the plaza from our left vanishing point rushes by that on both sides. So now we have a floor plane at the bottom of the cathedral that's going to hold all the weight of it. And we can quickly take the edge of these boxes, and you can see that even when they come down, they're becoming a bit broader each one. So even though they're going to have a series of flying buttresses holding up the nave on the side, even the towers themselves in detail are actually staggering out on every level. So there's more dead weight of stone, which is being slightly triangulated to help these towers rise up into the sky. So now we've got 1, 2, 3, and the double boxes up top, 4 tiers of space, all in simple boxes, which are going to hold or kind of create that shroud for a very detailed elevational study as we build this out. Mary takes pride of place at the center portal. So the detail inside here above the doors is about the Virgin Mary. Life of Christ dominates the side gates and the rose windows. And to the right of the central portal are scenes from Life of Mary, and the left portal are scenes from the depicts the Passion of the Christ. So the story again itself is told as if this is an open book that's sort of like a graphic novel. Rather than done with words, it's done with what the individuals are wearing, what they might be standing on, tells where they might be from in terms of the language, little small bits of architecture along the way. And now as we build out the different stages, we'll see some of the common language. This isn't like a Reims innovation. It's an embellishment in terms of the bar tracery and the detail and the sculpture. But the zones that are here are all typical of the growth of the French Gothic cathedral. So at the second stage here, there's another arch that comes down and lines up with the arch below it. But inside that, right in the center, if we can draw a square in perspective inside of that, and then bisect that square in both directions, we'll know that at this point, this point, this point, and this point, we can inscribe a circle within that square. So we're going to arc that edge down, arc this edge down, this one, and this one. So now, even though it's almost a pure elevation to it, it is a circle that's vanishing in perspective, the same as the box it's inscribed in. And this circle is very important because it's the rose window, which is meant to be the halo for Mary from the interior sculpture. So when you're inside and you're looking at light as the sun sets in the west, this will line up with the head of Mary inside of the second tier interior elevation of the nave. So this grand, glorious, super colorful range of stained glass window behind her is sort of heavenly halo of the Virgin on the inside. So that's part of this sort of sequence of ideas out front here. And then to support this going up, there are piers that run up to set this into its triptych. It's 3 types of vertical rises. And those break right at the line at the top of the square here. At that point, they become triangulated and take us up visually as they rise up and thrust the top of these very tall pyramids to the next level. And that has a horizontal break on it. That goes up to its certain height there. There are again small piers that carry that up. And finally, there is a triangulated top to the middle section, and then the bell towers. And the bell towers are within the form up here, which is cubic volumetrically and centralized. And so long, skinny arches drop down, because the intent is not only does this step out and triangulate this way, and then in section we saw it triangulates around the nave on the inside, the architecture is dissipating as you rise up. So as it's got its most mass here and it's least transparent, it's lightening up with more stained glass. So in fact, the building's sort of dissipating into the air with less and less hard architecture. So it becomes more linear pieces of diaphanous stone. They're rising up. And then when it comes to the bells themselves behind it, they split this arch with more bar tracery. And then now coming back in perspective to the right vanishing point, there are the acoustical louvers, which run back horizontally towards our vanishing point. Now that turns the corner, and the same amount of information wraps around here. So the bar tracery builds up toward that edge. And now this is also seen on the left side facing north. And so it's going to be an oblique view. So we just draw that thinner arch to wrap us around the corner there. If you find your pencil getting a little bit dull here, shift another one of your pre-sharpened ones to keep you always working with a fine point at this time, because we're just simply laying this out as line before we work into the value in a little bit. And then as the towers come down, you see from the side, they're going to come as you on the north side that we're going to see it, the same information here gets carried around this edge. So we can just repeat that coming down. We see it again obliquely because we're looking from this one side. So the front of the tower is the main subject. We're simply going to repeat this, knowing that every time we rotate around that corner, it's vanishing to the left point now. So this height over here, now all of a sudden is shorter on this side. That height is shorter here. And then the base of the tower juts around its corner. And so that'll sort of hold our front book of the biblical ideologies there. Now coming back on the front, this is the depth pushed in. On top of those are their own throw of sort of a finial arch. The two on the side being the same scale, the larger one in the middle. And those rise up to more decorative, detailed finish at the top. And then they set down over here to one last vertical bastion. Again, decorative, but also to counterweight the throw of this trying to break away left and right with its subtle triangulated form from top to bottom. 2,300 statues on its facade. Many were actually, if they were individual figurines of humans, were decapitated. The heads were beheaded by the revolutionaries in 1789, thinking that they were all important items from the church and the faith at the time, and the revolution was part about stopping the powers of the church. Sometimes they were mistaken in terms of what they were doing. They might have been the kings of Judea, other parts of the Bible, not actually the types of people that were associated in the biblical sense. So they've all been restored to a certain extent, and the smiling angel sculpture is the symbol of the city of Reims, because in World War I, when the church was engulfed in flames by a German bombing raid, they saw that the smiling angel, as it would be restored, would be a symbol for the city coming back too after World War I. So now it's difficult because it's a little bit of architecture, but it shows the whole length of the church. And so sometimes in perspective, all this information from the west to the east collapses into the support for this western facade. But nonetheless, it's there in our sketch. So now we want to draw this much of it in perspective too. And we'll see how that vanishes back. So the edge of the tower is what starts it, and then coming back at this height for a certain distance, it's fairly easy to draw because it simply is the rows of all the flying buttresses which come back and support it going back in a distance. So that collapses that distance a certain bit, and then we have the transept, which is going to pop out from that point of reference and then drop down itself beyond the flying buttresses as well. So even though this took 4 or 5, 6 inches of our drawing paper to get its width here, now we're taking about 3/4 to an inch of paper to show something that's much longer than this is wide. And that's what perspective is doing. It's condensing all the information into a smaller part of the actual point of reference on the paper. But just like the front elevation, that transept is going to have its finials up top that drop down, but every stage, when it meets the same stages of the front part of the church, it's going to step out as well. So it's counteracting its own thrust by having this very subtle triangular deform work at the edge of that. Now, this information, detail-wise, it's about a half of a city block away from us. This church is so long, so we can't afford to detail this like we detail the front of the church. So right now, after 10 or 15 minutes, we've got even though I've been talking through it, probably a 10-minute sketch if we just simply drew it. The notion is that you've got a nice image reference for Reims Cathedral in sketch form. As we apply more time and more detail to it, it grows from a sketch into sort of a quick drawing. If you spend more than an hour, it works into a full scale drawing, or if you spend a series of hours on it, and maybe it sort of converges into a rendering. For us, the idea is to get the idea of the church in a quick amount of time and understand the principles, because as you're drawing them and listening to what the vocabulary is for it, your understanding will be much stronger. So now we're going to look back at our facade and look at some of the details in between on the towers in terms of how they're articulated. Between the 4 piers here, which give us a triptych of the middle space, the 2 sides, there is an effort with the tracery to lighten the actual wall there. So it's not just sort of a bastion of Romanesque architecture, but it's delineated in linear elements. So there's throws of vertical skinny columns which lighten the load here. They do the structure just as well as the wall, but they're supported by a series of small arches. And then they rise up to the height here, and that's broken down by a crossing along its largest grand gallery up here, because as people make their ascent into the secondary and tertiary spaces here, there's exterior walkways across the outsides of these churches as well. And then that linear quality is replicated up here even more delicately with stone tracery, which is basically fraction the idea of just having a very mural wall and to have more of an elegance of this thing very sort of being lace-like. And that's how you proceed from the early Gothic, which is a vertical throw away from the Romanesque, to high Gothic, when it really kind of progresses to a point of it can't build any higher because physics simply shuts it down after a certain height of taking stone off the earth, to rayonant, which is a way where you sort of dissolve the idea of connectivity. It's more about pure light and the least amount of structure possible. So we drop down here. We want to sort of enter the church now and show, we'll do a couple of the doors open to show an access point to it. But the door heights, if this is the height of us, it's going to drop down more because I mentioned before, we'll be far away on the piazza looking back at this, the place looking back. So the door heights are underneath the horizon line here a bit, scale-wise. And Typically, it's a single door on the left and the right. This one's a bit off center because we're looking to get in perspective. We'll see more of this one. And then a double door based off the center portal there. And just to get the sense that it might be open for some festival, we're going to right away poche those as being sort of interior related, because in the daylight, even if this is well lit by electric light these days, or the sun is shining in, there's no way in the world an interior can compete with an exterior stone being lit by the sun. So any type of window or door will always appear darker. Okay, now we're going to do is sort of give it a relativity to Reims itself, because it's built in a modest-sized French town and never grew to the prospects of like a Marseille or Paris in the course of its history. So a lot of the existing framework architecture might have been changed stylistically, but the scale of it really hasn't. So in the course of working on this, we can come from our left vanishing point and build out a horizontal line which will show the heights of the neighboring buildings adjacent to Reims Cathedral. Coming off of this side, because we have our vanishing point this way, we can show an end of a street behind it, and then facades of the buildings just adjacent to Reims coming up over here. So to this day, it's got a very medieval aspect when you approach Reims, because you see the cathedral itself from many kilometers away, probably 20, 30 kilometers. You can see the towers on the agrarian plains of France over there. And when you come into town, you might drive around and get behind buildings and not see it. As soon as you turn the corner, it's incredibly powerful and convincing in terms of its presence with its Gothic throw vertically. So that'll give us a sense of what the medieval life would be. Obviously, contemporary Chartres might have a couple of buildings in the background that might have grown taller over time, so we can speculate about that and kind of develop that. But this part of the place is open more. I believe there's something up front here which shuts it down a little bit, but we'll have the sketch trail off to the right over here. And then we'll also do something to stop this building from coming too far up. And now that we come to the corner of it, we can use the right vanishing point to square that off. So now we can see how the city stops to create the plaza down below here. It's about 380 feet in length from the front all the way to the back, and it soars to the twin towers at a height of about 266 feet. So it's longer than the Seville Cathedral in Spain, and it's a little bit shorter than St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. So it's an enormous feat from the 1220s on, and grew to be one of the principal buildings that's finally eclipsed by Amiens a bit later, and then finally in Beauvais. Beauvais is the one that sort of stopped the idea of the high Gothic because physics said you couldn't build far. So they had lost their crossing twice when they tried to do this at a height, and so they realized they had to stop there. So nothing was built more than the apse and the crossing of Beauvais, and that was the end of the high Gothic in France. Still spectacular to visit all of those, because you see the mature of them and how they drove toward this race of Mary's Cathedral on Earth. So our next step then is to look back on the premise of perspective is there. We've got our horizon line, two vanishing points, and now it's about light, shade, and shadow. And so it's pretty easy to articulate the language of the light, shade, and shadow here, because all these churches had a really strict orientation to them. So we can quickly up here in our sky just lightly show a graphic for how these are laid out geometrically. And they all change in scale and size and scope and what the budget is and what they're building on, because they're usually built on Romanesque, early Christian, Carolingian naves, and expanding, trying to create a greater presence for the bishop at the time, the local bishop. So there's that processional path, which is basically cardinal axis, west, east, north, and south. And so the direction is this way. You're moving towards the sanctity of the Mass itself. And then the crossing. And the crossing can be a double crossing, a single crossing. It can be very thin and not very prominent. It can be very expressive, like it is here at Amiens. It's very minimal at Chartres Cathedral, for instance. And then the apse, which typically is an extension of the thickness of the nave, and then the ambulatory around that, so that there is sort of this circular feature, which is a different type of presence in the language of geometry where it seems like it's universal. And there's a spiritual aspect to it because it's not man-made, it's not box-like, but the sun coming in is being sort of pervasive. And so the otherworldly, the ideas of the church are coming from the east every day, Christ as the light itself, and then coming in to meet the people who then come out to the plaza out front. And so that movement there shows us if we simply have a setting sun, it'll light our front facade. And if it's probably 4 in the afternoon, it won't light the north. So this will be in the shade, this will be in the sun side. So our first little task then is if we know it's stone, we can come back in on that north side and simply wash those planes with the tone of gray. Now, because this is far enough back, the top of the crossing, the transept, which is probably lead coated over a forest of high timbers, and there's the markings of the roof, will be bleached white by the sun. So we'll leave that and the stone wall here facing west as bright, but the edges of it over here and then down where it doesn't receive light will become darker, all the way up to where our building has this left corner edge to it. And that'll be more dominant as we finish the sketch now. Now we can come inside all the places that are perforated. And so between these elements here, we've got the sense of viewing into the interior of the architecture. And there'll be 4 here that lead us in and 4 on this side. And so that creates that certain sense of moving beyond the stone into there. Underneath this arcade arch above the rose window, it's glazed. And then we'll spend a little bit of time here, even though we're not going to make the subject and detail it too much. We can come into how we've made this into 8 pieces, and we can break that up into even more to hint at the idea of the bar tracing for the rose window. And then each piece has got a little floral return to it. And so we don't have to draw them all in, but we hint at one side of it having some of that sense of floral. And then it kind of shapes itself with circles on the edge of it. And then there's a little bit of glazing, so we'll make the light appear to have some transparency by making part of that dark, and maybe the reflectivity makes some of it bright, but it shows the sort of diaphanous quality of that bar tracing around the rose window there. And then up here, every one of the things in the grand gallery, the elements up here ends in a little arch which connects the sides to them. And this is stone with a stone face beyond it, so it's not interior, but it will cast shadow onto itself. So we can simply come back and acknowledge that under those arches, there's a little shadow cast, and then the front column then projects a shadow line on the building. Same is true up front, all the way at the top where the bell tower is. These panels are dark panels, a metal clad material. So they're going to be much darker than the stone to start with. So they'll let a little light in beyond them. But they're shaped and they're pitched such they let the sound resonate when the bells ring, more than just the bells themselves. And that else gives some diaphanous quality to movement up there as it lightens its load. Turns the corner, and now we see more of, we won't see as many of the horizontal elements, but we'll see a dark path under the arch there. And then up top, it continues, so We see that coming to fruition up top with all the light coming from this side. All of our stone elements that project are going to cast a shadow onto that skin. We have our light side, our shade side, and now the things that come out are going to give us shadow cast. So next to all of our tall pyramidal shapes on our towers, it casts to the structure next to it. Inside of here is a slender arch that drops down. And now really critical to our entry is our cavernous aspect here. The whole underside of the sculpture that goes back and deep into this interior volume is all going to be in shade, the whole underside there. And that'll help push these things deep into the skin of the stone where the towers start behind it. And being in shade from that point, the sun doesn't reach those. The outside lip of this, of the architecture that's furthest out, does cast a shadow then on the flat plane against the wall. So that'll be a more acute arc, taller there. So we can go even darker where it casts a shadow. And so now that pulls that out, we're starting to see more shape in the elevation. And so the pieces of the very elaborate skin of Reims Cathedral starts to show more of a presence on our piece of paper. Because again, we're doing that illusion of creating 3 dimensions just on something that's obviously paper thin. And then finally, turn the corner on this one, there's a depth there, and we'll work on the line work later. But that should be a good start toward valuing Cathedral itself. So again, if we were to target the notion of it being a 40-minute sketch, we could say we're done now and this is the presence of it. But we'll keep working toward a solid hour here to get the spirit of as much as we can within that 60 minutes. So one thing to help shape this out will be the surroundings for it. And so if this is part of the village next to it, we could separate that into an array of buildings, and we'll make them a bit more medieval now, give them some spirit, and maybe some will have pitched roofs going back. And we'll simply give them a tone adjacent to it because that's facing north, not receiving light. And we'll break it there. With more of a flat roof to it. Again, it's not the subject, it's just trying to create the base of something happening here. And then we'll break this down into segments of buildings or architecture along the way. We could say that that's the first floor, second and third, and you can fenestrate it a little bit. Again, it's sort of like the icon of a building type, but it's not really a subject for us. And now really quickly, just to wash some tone into the sky, because if the stone is really brilliant and the sun is great from the west, the blues of the sky would appear like a gray. So now just with your pencil you've used most so far, just go to that sort of flat edge of it, and we'll come down toward the horizon line and simply do a wash of sky, all from the same sort of 45-degree point of view here. What we want to do is bring that all the way up to the towers so that the white of the tower up top has got something to contrast against. We're going to run that around the right tower in particular, and then bring it back down. And maybe wash it over our little sketch of a plan so it doesn't compete with our subject too much. So now that makes that white stone seem like it's a little bit more brilliant here, and it's got more power to its presence on the site. To help move the sky back in space, we're going to now push more value so that it's maybe brighter where the sun sets back here or rises in the distance, so that we change the value so it's not the same gray, it's more layers of gray going back. So maybe in the middle third, we'll do the same amount of gray, which will double up the value for that area. And we'll carry that through as if that's a type of sky or cloud pattern or in between the clouds, and rushes over to the other side, and maybe it's bolder in that zone. And so now this is when the pencil becomes having sort of an elliptical tip to it, and you're sort of working on the edge of the pencil rather than the point itself. Okay, and that sets us up towards where we're going to end up in a couple of minutes now. And so now we'll come back into our notion of this tracery. And the tracery is the lovely element, which I think you can see just in these two model formations between the two that are separated by maybe 150 years, 200 years of what stonemasons could accomplish. You can see the intricacy of Reims on the left compared to the more stoic, almost late Romanesque at some points with Notre Dame in Paris. And so we need to go back to our boxlight aspects and give it more definition to show the intricate profile here. So it's not going to be too literal, but it's going to show whenever there is a little bit of a change, there's a coping detail or a sculptural detail that gives it much more of an essence of movement along its values of the edge conditions. So we've done boxes before. Now we're going to look toward at the top here. There actually are little types of cupola towers that break up those corners. And so almost like we're kind of scribbling with the idea of this being much more organic and fluid rather than box-like. It'll come back to the top, the edge over here on this side, and then come down. And that's probably just all we really need once this arch ends up here. To show a little more of the cadence of what the stone looks like and the sort of bar tracery and the language of what the stonemasons could accomplish to make this much more delicate over the definition of Gothic in the eras. And that kind of happens as you rotate around every edge here, because this is the type of line that shows volume behind it has to be pulled up darker. And the things in front is less because it really doesn't hide space behind it. So wherever we see that, we have to come in with that kind of profiled aspect of moving detail along the skin of the building. Same is true with the tops of all the flying buttresses, and then coming back toward the edge of the transept, cutting back into the space in the distance and its top against the sky. Then our tower comes down close in front of us, and it's got a movement of detail and definition, which keeps stepping down into the grade there. We can come back into each of the little arches up top and make the underside where it first cast a shadow the darkest black. There's a finial on top of our center aspect here. So it's really a matter of just shaping the original type of perspective boxes we laid out for it. And this is very dominant over here because it against the dark sky. And then finally comes down to its last. area of detail, first aspect. Now, one more sharpened pencil to work on the three portals. And they all have statues on the finial aspects. And we're not actually drawing a person, we're simply drawing the shape or space holding for the person to be put there if we did more detail later. And then we give some dimension and weight to the edge that's closest to us. And we'll see those piers chased behind the columns. And now above our door line, these whole panels, the tympanums there, all have lovely sculptural detail. So we're really just going to scribble in the idea of light, shade, and shadow behind a whole series of details from the Bible that are articulated in those skins of stone. Now, the feet of it come down and the stone meets the floor as it projects away from the building. Then it recedes back to the door and then makes its way out again. Recedes back to the door and makes its way out again. So there's sort of a footprint profile that sits the building down on the ground. And we're going to take that black down and go back deeper into the sky that's adjacent to the building. Maybe right the one part of the neighborhood housing that's adjacent to it goes darkest right next to that stone to pull that good tone differentiation between them, because we're looking for the whites, the grays, and the blacks throughout and have it modulate through here. Probably right where we turn our tower from the biggest movement of mass in our sketch, which is closest to us, where the front on the west turns to the north, we can drive that gray a little bit darker right at that edge. And that'll give a presence of that really wrapped around the corner strongly. And then at the base of these, there's always detail. You can almost never stop with ROMs and putting in secondary detail here. We would have been done a while ago with Notre Dame because it was early to High Gothic, and this being later in High Gothic to Reynolds, it's a whole nother extrapolation of ideas that are inherent on the skin now. But we're getting close. And now as you look at this, we want to take the building itself and have it throw its own shadow. We've had shadows within the sculpture, within the skins, but now if light's coming from the west, it comes down to this corner and projects a diagonal pitch back here and will throw a shadow on top of the building and on the whole roadway here. And we'll go right through our initial person we drew there and not worry about that person right now. And that'll help sit it down and make our eye go around that corner as we play at that ground plane. Now, to help the building sit down, usually the stone of grade at the base of the building is a tad darker in tone than the skin of the building itself. So to differentiate between this plane and that plane, we're going to wash the whole plaza with a different type of stone and separate it from the side walkway in terms of we'll leave an interchange of something brighter at the edge. Now, to give us a foreground, which is difficult here because we're in the middle of a void, our foreground information, which kind of sets up the scale of it, is going to be Joan of Arc herself. So because she's the one that in her teenage years came back and defeated the English king and had taken over France all the way to the city of Reims. She came back in 1429 and rallied the French armies to defeat the British. And then she was obviously became a folkloric hero in the course of that 100 Years' War. And now she has a statue out here in the plaza as well as on the inside. So again, it isn't a subject matter, but we can do a little bit. You can see the tick marks down here of showing her silhouette on the horse, the equestrian move of the sculpture I just showed you really quick. All I do is kind of loose, kind of organic form like that. One or two legs coming down, and then the big plate of stone that she's on top of at her base. That's enough to kind of get a sense that you really sort of know you've arrived at Reims, because Joan of Arc is your featured entry piece there toward the plaza. So let's come in and do that really quick. A wash of tone that'll work to set the building down to its return on the ground plane. Doesn't have to be the same tone across the whole way. It could be darker right at the base here where our key corner is. But it's just enough to help the building not run into the white at the base. And then we'll do a little bit over here, so this ends up doesn't being as important as the white up above, because our job is to always house our whites when we're done with the grays and darks adjacent to it. Now there we have our sketch, and there we have the view we kind of drew it from. So next time we move into a secondary Christian church, and then a third, and we move into other cultures of religions to finish out the series of 10. Until then, pen before mouse. See you next time.